Hey guys, today's notes are going to be on something called CPCTC. Alright, so I'm going to introduce this by starting with our first example, which states that triangle hey is congruent to triangle man by, and we've got to fill in the blank. Alright, let's pay attention to how they named each triangle. They named the first triangle from the angle that had no curve to the angle that had one curve to the angle that had two curves. So that means to name the other angle, we should go in the same order. So the angle with no curve to the angle with one curve, and then to the angle that has two curves, which is angle N. All right, so the order is very important. Anyway, these two triangles are congruent by angle, angle, side. They've got two angles and a side that's not between them. So now we talk about this thing called CPCTC, and it says what other parts of the triangle are congruent? Well, angle H and M are congruent because they're both the first letters in those triangle congruent statements. Side HY and segment MN are congruent. Each of those are the first and last letters of the statement. And then side EY is congruent to segment AN. EY is the last two letters of the triangle congruent statement, and AN is the last two letters of the triangle congruent statement. So now I want to talk about CPCTC. That's what you guys just did. And CPCTC stands for corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Basically, it says that if you can prove that triangles are congruent, then their matching sides and angles are also congruent. All right, so let's practice another one. Example number 2. We've got triangle cat that's congruent to, remember the order is very important. To name the first triangle, they went from the double angle, so the double curve angle, to the angle with one curve, and then last to the angle that has no curve at all. So that's how I need to name the other triangle. So I'm going to go to the angle that has two curves, which is R, the angle with one curve, which is A, and the angle with no curve, which is P. So it's triangle wrap. And they're congruent by angle, side, angle. Now let's talk about their matching parts. Angles T and P are congruent. Those are both the last letters in the triangle congruent statement. CT, that's the first and last. So that segment is congruent to RP, the first and last of the second triangle's name. And segment AT is congruent to segment AP. Those are both the last two letters of the congruence statements for each triangle. All right, so now we're getting to the good stuff. We're going to do the proof now. So in the first example, it says segment AC is congruent to segment AR, and angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, and we're supposed to prove that angle 3 and 4 are congruent. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to mark anything from the given that they stated. And this proof is partially completed. The first statement is just given. And sometimes people like to separate the given statement, so the second statement is also the given information. From there, they said that angle CAL and angle RAS are both congruent. They're congruent because they're vertical angles, and vertical angles are congruent. Last, now we can finish this. We can go ahead and say that both of these triangles are congruent. They're congruent because of angle, angle, side, two angles and a side that's not between. And finally, the new stuff, we can go ahead and say that angles 3 and 4 are congruent and finish the entire proof by CPCTC. Basically saying that because the triangles are congruent, their matching sides and angles are congruent. All right, now we're going to start example 4, which states that angle NLM is congruent to angle LNO. So I'm marking that on my picture. The given information also states that angle OLN is congruent to angle MNL, sorry about that. And that's the given information as well. Notice I'm marking everything I can on my picture. For the next part, they want us to talk about reflexive and use it somehow. And reflexive is when they share a side, when your triangles share a side. So the side that our triangles share is side LN, segment LN. So segment LN is congruent to segment LN. All right, last, or for the next step, now we need to name the other triangle. Notice they went from L to M to N. L was one curve, M was no curves, and then N was a curve and a tick. So I named the other triangle the same, and they're congruent by angle, side, angle. And finally, we can end this by saying, because we said the triangles are congruent, that means those angles are congruent. All right, so now I'm going to do another one, example 5. And I'm marking everything from the given, and the given states that AC is congruent to segment BC, and segment AX is congruent to segment BX. By the way, that triangle is an isosceles triangle because it's got two congruent sides. Next in our proof, they want us to talk about reflexive, and both of these triangles share a side CX, so CX is congruent to CX. Next, now we're going to focus on the order of our triangles when we do our congruent statement. We went from A to X to C, so outside, inside, up, so we named the other triangle the same way, outside, inside, up, B, X, C. And those triangles are congruent by side, side, side. And then you can finish and say because they're congruent, their sides and angles are congruent as well. CPCTC. All right, one more example. It says angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. So I'm marking that on my picture. Angle 3 is congruent to angle 4. I'm marking that on my picture as well. And all of that is the given, and for some reason these notes did not separate the given this time. I guess they didn't feel like it. I never separate the given, by the way. All right, so next they're stating that side XZ is congruent to segment XZ, and that's called reflexive property of congruency. We're just saying they share a side. And here comes naming that triangle. Remember, this is important. They went from two curves to no curve to one curve. So that's how we're going to name the other triangle. From two curves to no curve to one curve. So Z, Y, X. And those triangles are congruent by angle, side, angle. And then we can finish it off and say, because the triangles are congruent, these sides are also congruent. And that's CPCTC. And y'all, that is it for today's notes.